Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Roll Wise podcast, the show where we talk about things related to tabletop RPGs. Recently, we played a game that was a little heavy on the violence. Eat the Reich was described as an ultra violent game, and we had quite a lot of fun with it. But it also got me thinking. There are games that kind of eschew violence, or at least don't provide rules for the violence to be handled in a normal way. And so, kind of looking at some of those, the other side of the coin, and some of those non-combat games, I thought would be a fun conversation for us to do today. And so, I think the nice thing is that when you look at these non-combat games, because you can't just fight it to win. You have to look at alternate solutions, alternate systems, and a bunch of other things that really kind of can expand your breadth of experience in role playing. But what do you guys think? What is your idea of like what is a non-combat game? Like, do you think there are no such thing as non-combat games, or do you have like an idea of like games that don't use that?
I mean, there definitely are games that don't have rules for combat or games that don't encourage you to not fight,
Hmm.
like, or not do violence or don't downplay the seriousness of violence. I mean, most adventure games like D&D, I'll throw D&D under the bus because it's the biggest, the big boy on the block. Like D&D kind of, it novelizes violence to a degree, which I'm not saying is a problem because I like action movies and I like those types of adventures. But like there are games that definitely discourage that as your answer. And then there are games, of course, that are designed just not to have that at all. Like that's not the point of the narrative at all. So they suggest you don't use that at all as part of your narrative. And we
Hmm.
looked, I think all of us kind of looked into some of those games this week because they're not. You have to look for them. They're not like other game. Like you kind of have to look for games that are designed that way because most games have some sort of resolution system that's either can be used for combat or suggest combat as an option.
Yeah, and I think before we get too far into this, I think it's worth saying that every game can pursue non-combat solutions. Like
Mhm.
no game
Mhm.
forces you into a quote unquote a D&D style combat whenever you have a conflict.
Well,
Um,
there are games where that's the point of the game. Like we talked about
there
before,
are
like Lancer, like if you're playing a Lancer game and you're not doing mech combat, you're kind of not
there ain't
playing Lancer.
You don't want to play. You can
well
play Mech Maintenance Simulator.
Like there, that's true. You could do that. We build robots. Yeah, you could do that. You're right.
you, you build robots
And keep
or
them
you
running, man, with
you know
insufficient
that's
parts.
I would be interested to see how many of the rules in Lancer support that, though. Like how much,
Probably not as many as I hoped.
how much repair mechanics are in Lancer.
Oh, we are having a mech parade. So you're all going to design mechs, and we're going to do a show parade, and yeah. Maybe. I mean, there are definitely games that seem like you're wasting a majority of the game if you're not using those rule sets. But no game, has to have violence for solve every problem. It's just much better to do it in
No,
giant
there's
mechs.
Well, yeah, I mean, recently the Deadlands game, the beginning of the Deadlands game, you guys didn't do any combat for a whole
Hmm.
session in that game.
right.
And it's gonna. I mean, you did in the next game. I mean, it's inevitable because it's kind of a western, so it's designed to be a western type
Hmm.
movie type thing, which means that that's part of it. But like, there's definitely games where you could do that
Yeah.
do have that and yeah that have that as a have the combat rules and stuff like that and maybe even a little more combat oriented, but that's not the
Hmm.
goal necessarily of the game.
Yeah. And
like
so.
like one of the things that's cool about Unknown Armies, um in the different editions, is there's a big thing in there about like how violence is probably not the answer in this game because
Mhm.
things happen when you choose that option in the real world, like cops show up or
Mhm.
people die. Like
Right.
there's a big blurb on it that's really beautiful that they wrote about in Unknown Armies, how it's like you might not want to pull a gun on someone because cops show up and you get arrested, and threatening violence
Mhm.
is a big escalation. And so
Well,
like
yeah.
violence is kind of discouraged in that game just from the modern world sense. So
Well, and I think you get the same thing in Spire too. Like Spire, the city must fall. Like it basically says you're, part of the ministry of the hidden goddess or whatever it is, and you're so vastly outnumbered and you're such a, lower class that if you just try to fight your way, like, old school resistance style, you lose, like your cover is blown or your family members get taken into the gulag or whatever. And
I disagree. Spire is a narrative game, but violence is definitely something that
it can exist, but
leans
they say
towards.
that, like, usually that was kind of like a more of a last resort kind of thing, because just you're just the low person on the totem pole. It's hard to
Well,
talk
you're
with Spire like that.
Inspire. You're fighting against a whole city,
Mhm.
so the combat stuff is small, but it's important to the game.
It can be, yes, but yeah, subterfuge is what I think that the part I was getting out of it. So combat exists, but subterfuge is better. So, so Jeff, what about you? You've seen a lot of different kind of examples of play out there. Like, what to you defines some of the features of these non-combat games that really set them apart from other games? That what their focus, I guess, would be the thing.
Well, I mean, there's quite a range of stuff, right? I mean, you can get right to the cozy games where you literally might be running a coffee shop, for example, right?
Hmm.
And that's what your role playing is, the day to day of running this business and interacting with people. Um, Investigative games in general don't you won't want to use a lot of combat
Hmm.
to solve whatever you're trying to solve. Even in Vason, a lot of the times, if you resorted to combat, things went bad. A lot
Hmm.
of the Cthulhu related games, maybe not Cthulhu itself, but yes, there's some fighting, but mostly with fists, because I don't know, when you pull a gun on an elder god, it's probably not going to go very well. Um, but so things, I mean, things run a gamut. I mean, I even remember a time when a lot of people were trying to make like political like intrigue games out of Dungeons and Dragons,
Hmm.
where they didn't want to use combat rules and they wanted to use charm and persuasion and have people act that out.
Hmm.
There's a lot of places you can go, like, or kids on bikes exploring the city like kids do, right? And you never know
Hmm.
what you're going to encounter.
Yeah,
Uh, an angry dog. You watch, I don't know, whatever what you see an accident, and sit there
Hmm.
and watch the cops come and make sure everybody's okay. And
yeah. I
it,
mean, yeah.
there's a whole bunch of different stuff.
The kids on bike games are a good example. Tales from the Loop.
Yeah.
The actual kids on bikes RPG. I
Yeah.
think those are good. Slug Blaster. Slug Blaster doesn't have
Does
really.
it?
I don't think so.
I thought it had some because
That's
you
definitely not the
could.
point of the game. That's definitely not the
No.
point of the game.
Yeah. So, because I do have a list of things, and I was kind of curious as to your thought about it, because it
Mm.
feels like the when games kind of eschew combat and kind of try to focus on other things, they focus on exploration, creativity, just problem solving, telling just a story, and all that kind of things, and kind of try to use other mechanics to engage players. Um, did you guys like look at any specific examples that were kind of outside your normal group of games that you've seen? Because I did look at one, because
I also
there's
looked at one. Yeah.
actually there was a bundle for sale on Itch that had this game that came kind of recommended as a good example of the non-violent resolution games. But it's the point of the game was also very different than what I was, like than we typically play with like Deadlands or any of these kind of things, where things could be tinged with a little bit of combat here and there. But I'd picked up a game called Yaziba's Bed and Breakfast. Now it doesn't sound like a crazy game. It sounds kind of like what you were talking about, Jeff, with like you're running a coffee shop. How do you run your coffee shop and everything like that? But first of all, this is part of a bundle right now on Itch. There was like an accessibility and role playing bundle or something like that. You can get this plus a lot of other games for $10 or more as part of this, raising money for awareness. I could probably put the link down in the thing
Yeah,
if
you
anybody
probably
else
should.
is interested in doing it.
Since you brought it up,
I
yeah.
don't even have the ability to tell you all the games that are in that, but it did have this. This game normally by itself is more than $10. So, You get the PDFs, all the extra accoutrement that goes along with it, and I thought it was a pretty good deal. So I'm not sure when we would play this game, but me, check it out. What was interesting about it to me, though, is that it kind of took a lot of those things that we talked about before, and rather than go through, detailed character creation or anything like that, this game actually just uses pre-generated characters. All the characters that it uses are in the book. They all have a very narrative type focus, where they have things like bingos and whoopsies, I think, are the names
Well,
for them.
any game that is very, I feel like any game that is focused on not like your normal adventuring stuff is
Hmm.
mostly going to be narrative, because you don't need a lot of
Yeah.
rules. You don't
Hmm.
need a lot. You don't need a lot of like complicated mechanics, because you're not doing things that
Require the
the
Right.
kind of
whole
simulationist.
the whole narrative is different. Combat is very simulationist, and so like
Right.
planning a fight usually has a lot of rules, so you don't need
It,
that many rules.
and it can. And I know that in some games, like, when we played Unknown Armies, you just had a simple dice roll to kind of determine a lot of outcomes from how, like,
That was over the edge.
or sorry, over the edge. My apologies.
They are
Um,
two different games. Fact check.
Well, over the edge has the very narrative, broad sweeping dice rolls. Unknown Armies is
Mhm.
a D100 system,
Yeah, yeah,
so
yeah,
it's more granular. No, I'm just so no one's
yeah. I know.
confused. Yeah.
I know. I meant over the edge, but it, much quicker resolution of mechanics. You don't have the similar granular thing, but it's still, you can still get into combat. Whereas this doesn't have really anything like that. It does focus on the role playing component quite a bit. And what it does is it gives you, I mean, in this 500 pages, there are literally chapters dedicated to, like, this is you and your friends. Let's say we got together and we were sitting down and role playing, we would pick a chapter. There would be somebody who's the concierge. Everything is bed and breakfast themed. And we would play through the story of a chapter, and the chapter itself has additional mechanics that are unique to that chapter, or maybe similar to another chapter or something. Where, much like in Flowered by the Apocalypse, you have to fulfill an objective, but at the same time, you're telling stories and adding your own unique spin to each of these characters' lives as they live in this bed and breakfast. And so, from a collaborative storytelling experience, it's actually fairly interesting. Um, and then, so if you're interested in that kind of, like, I'm really focused on this one scene of doing laundry, and how can you swap stories, and how can you prevent this kid from blowing up the laundry room, because there is like a little devil kid and like all these other things. So this kind of got some weird supernatural elements to it. And
Well, you have to, like, you have to have things that happen, and I think
Mhm.
that's sometimes where games I get confused on these games, where it's like, well, if you're not doing something, it's not really a story. It's kind of just
Go ahead. Finish your thought.
it's
No,
just
finish your
I
thought.
mean that's my thought. It's kind of just a thing like happening. Like, so I struggle with that a little bit.
That's
Mhm.
fair.
And I also struggle with the fact like no matter like when I think about real life, like my life, I'm not a adventurer. I don't go out and killing dragons, but I wouldn't say that there's never been violence in my life. So there not being
Mhm.
anything about that in a game also strikes me as weird. It's but it's idyllic, and I get that, and that's nice, but it's always weird, a little weird to me. It takes me out of it a little bit, that like it feels like it can't happen in some of these games.
Mhm.
Whereas like, well, it shouldn't happen, but that doesn't mean it can't. And so for it to be an I can't thing seems a little weird to me. Just but that's because I don't know. I'm raised on action movies in the 80s and
Yeah.
horror movies, and your media really kind of influences what kind of
Yeah.
stories you like to tell.
No,
Well,
it does. Go ahead.
and to be fair, it does acknowledge the point that you're saying, Brent, that if there's nothing that's, if there's no conflict, there's really no action or interest
Hmm.
in whatever you're saying. So there are two components that they created, that kind of like help you, kind of explore this as a role playing game. Say what your character does, work together to see what happens. So kind of play to see, instead of like have somebody try to outline a story and then have you kind of go through the theme park approach. But one of the things they really suggest is make a mess. And so they say sometimes our characters, if left to their own devices, may not want to do whatever is happening in a particular chapter. Yazid would prefer to stay in her office. Emily might rather be sweeping than getting into tomfoolery, but you've dragged them into the chapter. So we're here. If everyone was on their best behavior, nothing would be particularly exciting, would it? Our characters might want to be passive unyielding, but we'll have the most fun when we prod them to make bold choices and get in over their heads. So, and it does encourage that kind of play where rather than make the safe choice, make the interesting choice. And usually there are prompts.
Punching the customer. Yeah, exactly. See, and the interesting choice. Go ahead, Jeff. Sorry.
No, I think the favorite description that I saw when I was looking, and I was focusing more on the cozier end of things, was communal improvisational role playing or storytelling. Um, and the thing that I liked about the improvisational thing is that, like, the main rule of improv, right, is no matter what somebody asks you, yes and right. No matter what they give you, you don't just shut it down because you've got to keep this imaginary conversation that nobody knows what's coming next going. So you're trying to be additive. And a lot of times I think violence can be, like if you hit somebody hard enough to knock them out, then oh, problem solved, game over, we're done. But
Well, yeah, it's usually the easiest way to solve a problem in most like D&D games or those style games. It's like, oh, this thing's in the way. Well, we'll just punch it to death, and then we can go through it. Like that's I mean, that's where like the murder hobo thing comes from. Is like,
sure.
we solve our problems through an application of force.
And
Yeah.
but I think there's people now that want to solve problems other ways or play characters where physical
Yeah.
action isn't necessarily the answer. And I, I was kind of interested to see some of the different games that were out there.
And did you, Brent? You said you looked at a game. Did you have any
Yeah,
examples?
I didn't buy it because I will never run it ever. So I didn't buy it, but I did read about it and I was vaguely interested. It's called Under Hill by Water. Have either of you heard of this?
I have not.
Under Hill by Water, and partially it's because it's hobbits. But it's about living in the Shire. Like it's about living in the Shire, like not Lord of the Rings, but it's about living in the Shire. And the thing that I thought was clever about it is like, what do you do in Under the Hill by Water? This game is about capturing your aunt's your escaped Henri goat. The game is about growing the biggest turnip for the harvest festival. Your game is about gathering rare ingredients for a birthday feast. The game is about being simple and silly. And like, I like that description of the game just because it tells you like these are the problems that you have in this game that you'll have to work out how to fix. So it tells you that it's a cozy game, but it's not. There's things that you'll be doing in the game, which is one thing I liked. And the other thing is like I really struggle with like, and this is gonna sound weird because the Shadowrun games that I always like are sim life games, but like working in a coffee shop to me, because of my history in retail and stuff like that, sounds like death to me. Like I would not want to role play a game like that just because I've done that in my life. And I so I would struggle with that. But like, I don't know, hobbits going to the fair. Like there's things that are set up that I could see that I thought it was clever. And it's a game that like, but even in this game, like I could see like, two halflings get in a fist fight, like, or two hobbits get in a fist fight. I don't know, copyright rules work, but whatever it is. But like I could see that happening, your county fair and they get in an argument or whatever. But it is
Goat's the best.
Right. It's just kind of a nice game. And it was framed well enough to where I was interested to read some of it. But yeah, like and I guess when I look at the non-combat games, I guess one of the things that I like when I'm telling a story in a role-playing game, whatever system that I'm using, whether it has combat or not, is I want it to be an organic decision. Like if the players decide we're going to use violence on this, like I want them to have decided that that's how they're going to go, and then the consequences of that choice. Whereas this was a game where it's like, oh, you can't use violence, or it's really strongly discouraged that you use violence. It takes away part of that choice, and that's where I kind of have a struggle, I think. Like it's just, but and if the game's not designed like, but if it's like, yeah, you're, because I mean we've all had that. Well, I know at least two of us have had those games where it's like, oh, we're playing D&D. but the players decided they're going to run a theater company instead of going on the next adventure that I set up. They're like, no, man, we can't go get that gold from those goblins. We have theater times we need to work out. We need the set design and we need costumes. And it's like, oh, okay, I guess this is the game we're playing now.
Well, I mean, Deadlands could have been a lot shorter adventure. Well, we got this bounty we got to turn in. There's no one in this place. I guess we go to the next town.
It's true. You could have. I would have allowed it. We would have finished the game early, like you said, but
Well, that was. I guess we never really got into Shadow. What was it? It's Savage Worlds. I don't really know any of the rules.
right. I don't even know. Let's just ride on by. Yeah.
So
that would have been an interesting bit of improv. I would have had to come up to make the game interesting.
So here's something based on what you were saying there, Brent. What I feel is like when you have games where combat is always the answer, it makes combat very easy to see how the stakes look.
And I feel like that's a philosophy that D&D falls into very easily.
Mm-hmm.
Is everything's a nail and we're a hammer.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think these games manage those kind of things? And do you feel like that kind of inspiration can be brought into your regular game? So like if you don't have combat as an option, how do you manage the stakes of whatever it is? And how do you think that looks from your outcomes?
Well, like I said, the game has to have other things that they can do. Like the adventure hook for Under the Hill by Water is, oh, your aunt's goat got out. You need to go catch it. And no, you can't just kill it. Like, you have your aunt is going to be very mad if it comes back hurt or whatever. Like you're going to go out and catch the goat, or you're going to go and your plan is to, what do you do to ensure that you win the state fair this year? For whatever. Like those sorts of things. You need to have things that they do. Like I said, one of the things that I try and do in games when I run games is I try and I don't look at like it as bad guys and good guys. I look at it as problems that need to be solved and how they can solve them, because that's essentially what a bad guy, a villain is. The villain is doing this thing and it's a problem. Well, how do we solve it? And if we can solve it without, kicking his door in and shooting him in the head or whatever, like that's fine. Like, but I just want to see how the players solve the problem, not necessarily encourage them to do combat all the time. And I think that's kind of how, like, I think you see that in like the Deadlands game. Like you guys could have fought all the creatures that you found so far, but I'm not gonna
us to do. No.
Well, no, that's no, because that's not the point. Like I want you to do what you think your characters would do. Which means there's not a lot of, I don't feel like there's a lot of combat in most of my games. Because like I said, like if your players aren't total murder hobos who are like, we're gonna murder everything that moves, which I feel like these games are the direct reaction to that. Whereas there's all these D&D games that are like, oh, we just kick in the door and murder up the place real good. And I think these are a direct reaction to that, where they want people to be more involved in their characters and telling stories. And like you can do that in any game.
Sure. And Jeff, what about you when it comes to managing stakes? I know it's easiest to see your character dies if they fail this combat, but do you think that you get just as invested when, there are other stakes in the case of the game? Because I know you played a lot of board games, and I know that things like resource management is a really big thing. And if that was a component of the game and you feel like you're low on resources, you may feel compelled to, make narrative choices that you would make that as opposed to being like full up in the larder kind of thing. What do you think?
No, I think that there are high stakes in real life. And even real life is as you get away. I mean, I remember anytime you're around water, man, it takes one person slipping and falling, landing in water. You don't even have to like hit your head on a rock or anything. Like, have you ever, fallen into a creek in the middle of winter? The cold instantly seizes everything up and you can't move. And the first person to try to get you steps on ice and they're in there. And now there's two people in the water. Like, I don't know. I think there's a lot of ways, trying to get your grandma's goat back into the pen without upsetting it or harming it in some way. as somebody who grew up around livestock isn't as easy to herd
I
as
was,
they make it seem on TV.
I was gonna say I've done that. I've played that, but that sounds more interesting than like serving coffee, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, it depends on the type of game you want to play, right?
Sure.
I we're using these games as an escapist
Mm-hmm.
mechanism, right, to get away from our
Mhm.
day to day stuff, and like Brent said, something where he's like, you know, working at Costco, checking people out for 14-hour shifts, and then go, you know, like
Hanging
that's not gonna Brent's not gonna have fun playing that
hang,
game.
hanging clothes at your local Ross. That's what we're that's the game that we're playing today. We're playing retail store.
Yeah,
No, thank you.
right. But there are other things like, let's say we went on a road trip, right,
Mhm.
with no destination in mind. And there's the conversation about what music are we playing, where are we stopping, when are we stopping, where are we going,
Mhm.
the kinds of things. Like, we've all had adventures in our lives with people that we've done stuff with, because I've heard stories from both of you, and most of them didn't involve violence. A few do,
Mhm.
right? But I remember sunburns. I remember people getting lost. I remember, like,
I feel like
all
these
kinds of
stories are all
stuff
about me.
where there's hijinks. Mike's a little more closed-lipped.
But
uh,
no, just Brent
but
likes to talk about all my failures.
your failures, the sunburns and the getting lost, I'm pretty sure were me. Anyways, I guess that's one thing that I wanted to point out is like, I feel like the cozy games and these exploration games, or ones that don't like encourage combat, really the main thing that they encourage you is to get your like have your character and play your character, like focus
Mhm.
on being that character and doing what that character would do. And I feel like that's really something as a DM that I try to get my players to do in every game. Like, I want you to make your character's decisions. And most of the time, if a character becomes a fleshed out character,
Mhm.
everything isn't going to be, I punch it in the dick. It'll be, it'll be, well, I don't want to die. So I'm not just going to attack this thing. I'm going to try and figure out a way to do
Mhm.
something different or put myself where I have an advantage, like that sort of things. And I think that's the type of thinking that really these games encourage. And I think I encourage people to try and do that in any game, is
Mhm.
try and get your players to really play your characters, because they won't be as murder hobo-y if they love their character and want to play the character and want to see their character do well. Like, that's one of the reasons why I like the Shadow Life games that I always like. Where the shadow ones aren't really the important part. It's your character making sure they get to their appointment the next day.
Mhm.
Like, or taking care of their family or whatever. Like, that's why I like those games, is because it's that cozy life game, but it still has that added element of, it's Shadowrun. It's, you have to deal with trolls and you have an outlaw job, and like there's other things that make it interesting. And I think that's the focus of these games too. It's just
Yeah.
not a goat in Shadowrun. And
Right.
in Underhill over by the
Hookah.
water, it's a goat. Yeah, your hookah store. Like,
But it
how
did surprisingly well. I
we
mean,
have to go on this Shadowrun because we need money to support the store. Yeah, like
yeah.
that sort of thing.
But and I think that's a good conversation, because it's, it sounds like really, if your immediate consequence isn't death, it's like you make interesting consequences because you create setbacks and additional challenges. You create alternate story paths than like what might you have expected. Like, if you can't just, as you said, punch them in the dick. I mean, what's the story look like in that scenario? But I also
And
think that there's.
And
Oh,
if the
go ahead.
answer's punch, and if the answer's punch him in the dick every time, is that really an
Mhm.
interesting story? Because after a while, it won't
No. And
be.
and I think that there's something to be said that sometimes in these games where, violence is not, you don't get those stark, like I live or die kind of things. I think you can find that you tell a, different completeness in the story.
Mhm,
Like, and I mean, the one example I have of that, which was interesting, is when we did Vason, and I was like, well, this game was an absolute failure, the whole
mhm.
fishing game, because I was like, what the F? Like, oh man, we didn't do anything. And you guys were like, yeah, we saved the
We
girl. And I
won.
was
Yeah,
like, yeah, you won.
yeah. And there's one combat in that game. There's one fight, and that was the knife
Hmm.
fight at the end,
Yeah.
which involved me. Big surprise. But yeah, like, and I think that was a really good game. We did, and it's funny because, yeah, we all did feel very victorious at the end of that game.
No, we
Yeah. And
did.
it
We
was
felt
just,
good.
But like to me, I was like, oh, I didn't tell the complete story. You know, like there was more to this story, and you guys were like, got the girl. Fuck you, Mike.
Well, but I mean, the part of that is to touch on Brent. When if you're role playing stuff and you're doing like real life
Mhm.
things, you're invested in that character,
Mhm.
right? You're 100% invested because you're giving them goals and decisions and backstories and all kinds of stuff.
Mm.
And a lot of the storytelling games utilize that kind of stuff. And if the party is telling a collaborative story loosely tied to a plot, like in the basing game, because that's kind of what happened. We sort of couldn't figure out the whole thing, but we got enough breadcrumbs that we accidentally stumbled into the end, and we did get a resolution.
Well, we latched onto a victory condition. To what we did.
We did,
We
yeah.
said we
But it
don't
was
know
like,
We don't know what's going on. This girl got kidnapped. We can save her. We can do that.
yeah, and so we did create an ending. Uh, if you zoom in though and just focus on the characters, like you're right, Mike, we had
Mhm.
fun. But you, who saw the 10,000 foot view, right, zoomed out, was like, there's a little more to do if you guys want to try to do. And we're like, no, we're going home. We
Well, we're gonna go past this destroyed village, and we're just gonna get out of here. Like
She's
there was,
safe. We're happy with that.
yeah,
it,
we saved the girl.
yeah, and so there were, and so it's interesting because I think when you look at those kind of alternate like consequences and everything like that, you know, whether achievements and consequences, I think that's it's a very fascinating way to do, and to do the game because it does get kind of like if you're running through like you know Lost Mines of Fandelver, it's just like I see something with green skin, I kill it, you know, like
Right.
you know,
And I think the other thing you have to be careful about in these games, these cozy sort of games, is if it's just like living your character's life, like
mhm,
that can feel kind of like there isn't an end. Like it just feels like it could just go on, like, and you could just go on forever, but it's
yeah,
probably not the story that you always want to tell.
yeah,
So like having goals and little accomplishments and like an end or a goal for your character to end at, I think might
mhm,
be important for these sorts of games too. Like if your hobbit wants to get married, that's what he should that should be like his end goal
Sure.
of his story.
mhm,
Because I think that'll make you feel fulfilled. I think just like like living every day of a character's life without like that sort of thing. Oh man, this
yeah,
probably could get philosophical pretty quick. But like doing that is when you're telling a story makes the story feel like, oh well, this just could go on forever.
mhm,
Versus like having a goal where it's like, oh, this is the end of my character's story. He got married and he had kids
yeah.
and or whatever.
Yep, and that's kind of one of the reasons I thought Yazibas sounded much more interesting after I started reading it is because each chapter was just a
Hmm.
like an improv session for these characters, but it gave you mechanics that made the chapter unique and interesting, and they were like active mechanics, like chaos tokens that you tossed up and tried to get them all on heads. So basically, try to get a coin flip for these on heads or something like that. But there was antagonism between the you know some of the characters, so there wasn't just like well we both just sit here and stare at each other, you know, and so you kind of had that active. It wasn't player versus player, but it was like you all had objectives to do, but it also had a distinct end, like you got your laundry
Hmm.
done.
I
So
think I think a game that does well that is a hidden game, like
mhm,
non-combat game that's about travel and exploration. I think Electric State is more like that than it's definitely more of that like that than D&D. It's definitely it's a lot about your character go like the journey of your character from point A to point B. And I
mhm,
think it would and I think that's a game that I feel like is probably the I guess it's not a mainstream game, but it's the most traditional role-playing game I think I've seen that is played that way. Like the journey is what's important, not like fights are not going to be important. Like you're going to be asked to do clever things, not necessarily combat-y things.
you could, I mean, honestly the rules exist for both in that, so you can get into fights with unknowable you know construct looking things, but the because I've read the Electric State pretty far. I think I'm almost finished with the book. I don't have very much left, but
But what I'm saying is like all of these games
mhm,
like deciding to punch somebody should be in any game, unfortunately.
yeah,
Like because that's something that happens. Like
Well, you can, but a lot of the narrative games, right?
mhm,
You do it through storytelling rather than through rolling dice or because there's a specific rule.
yeah,
Right. But a lot of these games discourage that sort of thing pretty heavily, I feel.
Mhm.
Like it's definitely not the thing that they want you to be doing. Like I said, punching
Well,
the customer in your cozy little inn is probably frowned
and
upon in
even
that game.
The Golden Sky Stories, when we looked at that, so many years ago. I think it's been a
Last
while
year.
since we looked,
It was like 2
but
years ago, I think.
basically, it said like, no, we don't want combat to be part of this. You're cute little
They
henge
did.
creatures and living in this like mountain village that's the boundary between nature and civilization, and we don't want you to go around being ferocious, dangerous like creatures. We want you to be cute little spirit creatures having cute
Right.
little adventures. And I was like, okay. But I think that the conclusion that I get out of this is that I playing more games opens your mind, right? I mean, if you're lucky and you can play D&D and you have a robust experience doing all these things, that's great. I think playing other games gives you more tools in your tool belt, and there's a whole list of these types of games that you can play to try, just to see if it inspires you in the other games that you play. So,
And you might find
um,
one that if it's not your jam, you might still find one that you find interesting. Like I said, Underhill
mhm,
by Water is totally not something that I would normally even look at. But I found it interesting and I read about it and it made me think on the topic of like, what are these sorts of games like? And
mhm,
Yeah.
what's the difference between a regular game and one of these games?
Yeah,
yeah,
I think the one I looked at closest was Wander Home, which actually won an
mm,
Emmy in 2022.
Hmm.
yep,
It's not only is it cozy, it's GMless.
mhm,
It's
yeah,
prompts. Um, I would play it at some point. I don't know that I would play it often, but it's something that if you could find the right hook,
mhm,
you could have a tiny adventure on.
yeah. Well, Wanderhome and Yazivas are both done by the same person.
Oh, are they? Okay, cool.
Yeah, Jay
I didn't know.
Dragon, I think, is the author.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Mhm, yep. So,
Yeah, but it doesn't have Tokeland hobbits in it like my game.
It does not. It does not have hobbits. You found the only hobbit one. Well, I don't know. There could be
the, o-
hundreds. I
I'm
don't
sure
the
it's not
only
the only Hobbit one, but it stands out to me as a definite Hobbit game.
the only one licensed by the
Oh
Tolkien.
no, it's not. I'm sure it's not licensed by Tokeland either.
They're hoblets. Something to make them unique and distinctive so that they're not
Do they
violating
call?
any sort of
Oh
copyright.
no, they call them halflings, not hobbits.
Oh, they're
They call them.
halflings.
They
See,
do call them halflings, but they do
There you
mention
go.
Token in it. But they do call them halflings, so they don't get crushed.
That's fair. That's fair. So with that, I think I'm really curious if anybody else has played these games that have focused on non-combat. How do they resolve it? What's the most interesting mechanics you've seen from those types of games? Share your stories in the comments. We'd be curious to read what people have learned, what people experienced, and whether or not you like them, or do you just like swinging your sword and killing everything as you go? Because you've left the path of murder hobo, but you went right back. Let us know.
Some people
well, I
like
mean,
those
you don't have
games.
to be a murder hobo to want to just. Your escapism is fighting back where you can't in real life. Like,
Tell us about your Lancer mechanics game.
yeah,
How
I
you
do
you
want to.
just
I do want to play that guy in Lancer that's always got the cigar and the oil rag and just some random part for the mech where I'm walking around talking about how cheaply it was made.
it's a very different game than I think Lancer is intended to be. Very different.
But let us know in the comments. And outside of that, if you want to talk to us, Jeff, how do they speak with us again?
They find us on social media. We are at Rollwise, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Twitter, Blue Sky. We're still trying to get Mike on the TikTok account. Or they can email us, rollwiseguys@gmail.com.
And as always, roll well, roll wise, and go play some good characters.
Mhm.
Bye, everybody.
Bye,